In 1885, a 22-year-old woman challenged a famous gunslinger to a duel right in the middle of the street. She won. He died. And her name? You've never heard it. That's no accident. It was by design. For more than a century, editors, politicians, and historians deliberately erased the most dangerous, wealthy, and powerful women of the Old West. In this video, you're gonna meet 25 of them. And the last one was more feared than Billy the Kid. Number 1. Most women in the West carried guns. That wasn't the exception, it was the rule. Store records in Dodge City and Tombstone show that women bought revolvers almost as often as men did. Small derringers became a common item for them, hidden in purses and even in corsets. That whole idea of a fragile young woman waiting to be saved by a cowboy. Pure Hollywood fiction. In real life, a lot of these women carried a .32 caliber and knew exactly how to use it. In isolated areas, where the law basically didn't exist, knowing how to shoot wasn't a matter of style. It was a matter of survival. And there's one detail almost nobody talks about. A lot of them were better shots than their husbands. Number 2. Women who owned saloons controlled entire towns. Everyone thinks the sheriff ran the town, right? Not always. In many Old West towns, the people who really ran things were the women in charge of the saloons. Think about it. The saloon was where men spent money, made deals, worked out political agreements, and loosened their tongues after a few drinks. The woman who owned that place heard everything, knew everything, and decided who got in and who got thrown out. She controlled the flow of money and information at the same time. In places like Tombstone and Dodge City, politicians went to those saloons to ask for these women's support before any election. The real center of power wasn't the mayor's office. It was the bar of a woman most history books simply pretended never existed. Number 3. Soiled doves was the polite term. The truth was very different. History books boiled these women down to a single word. But what nobody tells you is that many of them owned entire properties, lent money at high interest, and built up more wealth than the ranchers and merchants in the area. Some of them helped fund the building of schools and churches in the same towns that publicly condemned them. The label was never about morality. It was about hiding the real economic power these women gained at a time when they couldn't even open a bank account in their own name. And the question nobody asks is, why did the most influential men in those towns never want that part of the story to be told? Number 4. History books always treated Annie Oakley like an exception, like she was the only woman in the Old West who knew how to shoot. That's not true. Lillian Smith joined Buffalo Bill's show when she was just 15 and competed directly with Oakley. But there were many others, women who entered official shooting competitions and beat experienced men without any kind of advantage. It wasn't luck. It wasn't some circus gimmick. They were just better shots. Records show that Wild West show promoters recruited women sharpshooters because audiences would pay to see what they didn't believe was possible. And the more those women won, the more money the organizers made. Nobody called that equality back then. They called it entertainment. But knowing how to shoot was only the beginning. Some of these women weren't satisfied with competing. They crossed the line into outlaw territory. Number 5. Pearl Hart, the last female stagecoach robber in American history. By 1899, the Old West was pretty much over. Trains had replaced stagecoaches, and the law had made it to the territories. But Pearl Hart didn't care about any of that. She cut her hair short, dressed like a man, grabbed a .38 revolver, and robbed a stagecoach in Arizona. She took $430 from the passengers. When she was arrested, the press lost its mind, not because of the robbery itself, but because a woman had done it. The trial turned into a circus. Pearl said no man had the right to judge her because women couldn't vote. She was sentenced to 5 years. but she only served a year and a half. The official reason for letting her out? That prison was no proper place for a lady. The same system that convicted her used her femininity to set her free. Number 6. Flora Quick, the horse thief no sheriff could catch. Flora Quick operated in Indian Territory, stealing horses right under the authorities' noses. She wore men's clothing, changed routes every week, and knew trails no posse could follow. The sheriffs would catch her, and she'd escape. They'd catch her again, and she'd disappear, all over again. It got to the point where local newspapers didn't know whether to cover her as a dangerous criminal or as a joke, because every time she got away, it was the lawmen who looked bad. And here's the detail nobody talks about. She wasn't working alone. Flora had a network of contacts spread across the territory, helping hide the horses and throw off anyone chasing her. The whole system kept failing against a woman who, according to records from the time, was barely in her 20s when she started. Number 7. Belle Starr wasn't just any outlaw. She led men who were outlaws. She ran a horse-stealing network, hid people running from the law, and was said to have direct connections to Jesse James. She married a Cherokee warrior named Sam Starr, and together they became the most wanted couple in Indian Territory. Belle carried 2 revolvers, rode fine horses, and wore velvet like she was part of high society. She was arrested, put on trial, and still kept operating. But in February 1889, 2 days before her 41st birthday, someone shot her in the back on a dirt road near her ranch. She fell off her horse and died right there. No one was ever convicted of the crime. To this day, it's one of the oldest cold cases in the Old West, and the main suspect was her own son. Number 8. Laura Bullion was the only woman accepted into the Wild Bunch, Butch Cassidy's gang. She grew up around outlaws, learned to shoot as a child, and before long she was taking part in train robberies. She also passed counterfeit money through towns across the West. In 1901, she was arrested and sent to a penitentiary in New York. She served her time and got out in 1905. After that, she simply disappeared. She lived the rest of her life quietly, without drawing anyone's attention. The striking part is that Laura didn't die until 1961. She lived to see the Old West disappear, made it through 2 world wars, and reached the era of color television. A woman who robbed trains with Butch Cassidy lived long enough to see mankind getting ready to go into space. Everything she lived through died with her. Number 9. Etta Place. Nobody knows who she really was or where she came from. She appeared out of nowhere alongside the Sundance Kid, traveled with him and Butch Cassidy all the way to Argentina, and helped with bank robberies down there in South America. And then she simply vanished. There's no death certificate, no grave, no record of her anywhere after 1906. Some say she went back to the United States under a fake name and lived an ordinary life. Others swear she died in a tiny town somewhere in Patagonia. The truth is, nobody ever found out. She's a ghost history was never able to track down. These women broke the law without blinking. But the next ones did something the Old West considered even worse. They broke gender rules. Number 10. Charlie Parkhurst was one of the most respected stagecoach drivers in California. He drove stagecoaches along dangerous roads, faced off with bandits, and even lost an eye in a horse accident. In saloons, he drank, smoked cigars, and spit on the floor like any other guy. In 1868, Charlie voted in the presidential election, something no woman was allowed to do at the time. He lived that way for decades, without anyone suspecting a thing. When he died in 1879, the doctor who examined the body was shocked. Charlie was actually Charlotte. The whole town had been fooled for years. But what was even more surprising was that Charlotte had given birth at some point in life. That means she hid not just her identity, but an entire story we'll never know. 50 years before women's suffrage. This person had already voted as an American citizen. Number 11. Mountain Charlie wasn't some tough old West man. She was Elsa Jane Garin, a 15-year-old widow who decided starving to death was not an option. She cut her hair, put on men's clothes, and disappeared into the world. For 13 years, she worked in mines, drove mule teams, opened businesses, and nobody suspected a thing. In April 1, she published an autobiography telling the whole story. And what happened? Nothing. Society simply pretended it hadn't read it, because admitting that a woman had survived on her own better than most men was something nobody wanted to face. The book was pretty much forgotten for decades, not because it was a lie, but because it was too true. Number 12. Losin, the Apache warrior the Americans tried to erase. She was Chief Victorio's sister and fought beside him in real battles against the United States Army. Apache warriors themselves said she had an almost supernatural ability to sense the presence of enemies before any scout could. Losin never married and refused any domestic role. When Victorio was killed, she kept fighting alongside Geronimo. She was captured and sent to Florida as a prisoner of war, where she died of tuberculosis far from her homeland. And in American history books, hardly any mention of her for decades. A woman who stood up to an entire army simply vanished from the official record. Number 13. Charlie Parkhurst and Mountain Charlie are the best known, but frontier records show dozens of cases of women living as men. Frontier records show dozens of women who lived as men in the Old West. Some were only discovered when the doctor prepared the body for burial. Others were never discovered. Mountain Charlie fought in the Civil War without anyone suspecting a thing. Little Joe Monahan worked on ranches for years in Idaho. The truth is simple. The rules of that society were so harsh on women that many came to the conclusion that the only way to have freedom was to give up their own identity. But the next women we're going to see didn't need to hide. They dominated the Old West by being exactly who they were. Number 14. Mary Fields was over 6 feet tall, smoked cigars, and carried both a revolver and a rifle. She was the first black woman to work for the U.S. Postal Service, delivering mail on one of the most dangerous routes in Montana. Heavy snow, wolves, and bandits were all part of the job. One night, her horses froze to death during a blizzard. Want to know what she did? She threw the mail sack over her shoulders and walked for miles in the dark to the next town. She never missed a single delivery. Locals said not even the sheriff scared people as much as she did. She had a reputation for taking down any man who caused trouble. They say she once knocked a guy out with a single punch. No wonder she became known as Stagecoach Mary, a nickname nobody dared say to her face. Number 15. Nellie Cashman made real money in mining in Alaska and Arizona, at a time when women could barely even open a bank account. She invested in mines, ran restaurants, and even paid for hospitals out of her own pocket. But what really drove people crazy was something else. Every time a journalist asked why she had never gotten married, her answer was always the same. I don't have time for a husband. Simple as that. At a time when marriage was pretty much the only acceptable option for a woman, Nellie ignored that rule her whole life. And the most impressive part is that nobody managed to force her. Not society, not the church, not the pressure from the men around her. She died at 73, single, wealthy, and in charge of her own choices. This kind of woman existed in the Old West, but history books would rather not tell that story. Number 16. Ah Toy arrived in San Francisco in 1849, right at the height of the gold rush. A Chinese woman, alone, in a city dominated by miners and outlaws. And what did she do? She built one of the most profitable businesses in the city. Within a few years, she became one of the richest women in all of California. But the most impressive part wasn't even the money. Ah Toy personally went to court to fight for her rights. at a time when Chinese immigrants couldn't even testify against white people under state law. She stood up to judges, corrupt police officers, and politicians who wanted to destroy everything she had built. She was sued, threatened, and still didn't back down. A Chinese woman challenging California's legal system in the 19th century. And most American history books never even mentioned her name. Number 17. Alice Ivers was born in England, studied to become a teacher, and seemed headed for an ordinary life. But when her husband died in the Old West, she had to fend for herself and discovered she had an incredible talent for poker. In Deadwood, she sat down at tables dominated by men, lit a cigar, and didn't leave until she had taken all the money. She kept a .38 revolver in her lap while she played, and nobody was crazy enough to try to cheat her. They say that over the course of her life, she won the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of dollars in today's money. But there was one rule she never broke. On Sundays, she didn't touch a single card. It was the Lord's Day. From Monday to Saturday, though, any cowboy who sat across from her knew he was going to lose money. She became known as Poker Alice and proved that in that brutal world, a woman with intelligence and courage could dominate any game. Number 18. Donna Tules, the woman who controlled New Mexico politics through gambling. Gertrudis Barceló ran the biggest gambling house in Santa Fe. Politicians, military officers, and merchants all passed through her tables, and she knew every secret each of them had. When the American Army invaded New Mexico in 1846, they didn't go looking for the governor to negotiate. They went looking for her, because everyone knew who really ran that town. Donna Tules financed campaigns, lent money to officers, and decided who rose or fell in local politics. All of that at a time when women could barely even have a bank account. And when she died, the American press made sure to erase it all. They reduced her to nothing more than a Mexican prostitute. They erased the gambler who had governors in her pocket. Wealth and power were already unacceptable in a woman. But the next ones did something the system really couldn't tolerate. They fought. Number 19. Sally Skull traded horses in South Texas, spoke fluent Spanish, and shot better than most of the men in the region. She was married 5 times. 2 of those husbands died under circumstances nobody could really explain. And when anyone was bold enough to ask what happened, she would just smile and change the subject. The chilling part is that no sheriff ever opened an investigation. Nobody wanted that fight. They say armed men would cross the street just so they wouldn't end up in her path. At a time when women could barely own property, Sally went around armed, made deals with outlaws, and lived exactly the way she wanted. Her 5th husband disappeared with her in 1866. The 2 of them vanished and were never seen again. Some think he killed her for the money. Others say she staged her own disappearance. Number 20? Everyone's heard that name, but almost nobody knows the real story. Martha Jane Canary worked as a military scout, drank more than most of the men around her, and wasn't afraid of anything. But Hollywood decided to turn her into a romantic heroine, making up a love affair with Wild Bill Hickok that probably never happened the way they tell it. The reality is very different. She spent the last years of her life in poverty, struggling with alcoholism, doing cheap circus shows just to survive. She died practically forgotten in a boarding house in Deadwood. The myth was built on her name, but nobody ever bothered to ask who Martha Jane really was behind the legend. And that's why history books lie, because the truth doesn't sell as well as fantasy. Number 21. In 1851, a Mexican woman named Josefa Segovia was living in Downeyville, California, right in the middle of the gold rush. One night, a drunk miner kicked in her door. She did what any cornered person would do. She defended herself with a knife and killed him. The next day, the whole town set up a makeshift court in the town square. No lawyer, no real jury, No chance at all to defend herself. Within a few hours, they had already decided her fate. Josefa was hanged that same afternoon in front of a crowd of 2,000 men. She's considered the first woman executed by lynching in California. And here's the question nobody back then had the courage to ask. If Josefa had been a white woman defending her own home, would that rope have been tied the same way? Number 22. In the late 1800s, a woman ran a theft and fencing operation right in the heart of Dallas. Records from the time called her the Bandit Queen. She coordinated thieves, handled stolen goods, and moved money for years without ever being touched. And the reason is almost comical. The police simply couldn't accept that a woman was the one in charge. Investigators followed leads that pointed straight to her and dismissed them because it didn't make sense to them. When they finally decided to act, they were shocked by the size of the operation. She had built a scheme that rivaled any male gang in the region. And the lesson here is brutal. She wasn't even hiding that well. The prejudice of the police themselves was the best protection she could have had. But crime and violence are only part of this story. What comes next reveals something worse: how the system of erasure worked from the inside. Number 23. The 20th century publishing industry rewrote the Old West on purpose. When dime novels turned into movies, and movies became the official version of history, editors and screenwriters made a conscious choice. Women would be damsels, prostitutes, or background characters. Manuscripts with female leads were rejected. Biographies were rewritten to downplay their roles. Women who ran ranches, led businesses, and stood up to outlaws had their stories cut out or reduced to footnotes. Hollywood needed simple heroes and clear villains, and strong women didn't fit that script. The erasure wasn't forgetfulness. It was an editorial decision, systematic and deliberate. Number 24. Thousands of records of armed women in the Old West exist in museum and university archives. Rifles, revolvers, horses, it's all documented. But most of it never made it into the books. And when an image did show up, the caption would just say, "Rancher's wife," or "Unidentified woman." No name, no story. Nobody asked who she was or what she had done. That wasn't an accident. It was a choice. Curators and editors decided these women didn't deserve to be remembered for what they did, only for the man standing next to them. The result was a silent erasure, just as effective as any official censorship. Entire generations grew up thinking women in the West only cooked and waited for their husbands to come back. The truth was there the whole time. It was just locked away in a drawer. Number 25. Pearl Hart pulled off the last stagecoach robbery in American history in 1899. Armed and disguised as a man, she held up the passengers and disappeared into the Arizona desert. Billy the Kid became famous for killing, but Pearl challenged the entire system. At her trial, she told the jury that no man had the right to deny freedom to a woman. The jury acquitted her. The judge, furious, came up with another charge to lock her up. In jail, she became a national sensation. Newspapers all over the country covered her every move. When she got out of prison, she disappeared completely. Nobody knows where she lived or where she died. School books taught generations about Billy the Kid, but Pearl Hart's name was deliberately left out. Now you know 25 women the Old West tried to erase. Tell me in the comments, which one of them deserved her own movie?